So people are still walking in. We will begin momentarily. Thank you for joining us. I will start with a housekeeping note for our online participants. As you may have noticed, if you use the link for direct access to the meeting, your name shows up as an online participant. You are welcome, although by no means required, to edit the name, add your real name or organization, but we're happy to have you here in either case. Thank you for joining us in person or online at the for our event at the 66th session of the Commission on Narcotic Drugs. Thank you to our co-sponsoring NGOs and especially Leonardo Fiorentini of Forum Droga for invaluable assistance once again this year. And a special greeting to guests from the local Filipino community here in Vienna. My name is David Borden. I am the founder and executive director of DRCnet Foundation, also known as StopTheDrugWar.org. This is the 15th in a series of forums we have held at UN and other international meetings that either in whole or in part have dealt with extrajudicial killings in the Philippine drug war, as begun under now former President Rodrigo Duterte. Our first took place 6 years ago here at the CND. 3 weeks prior to that, Senator Laila de Lima was jailed in the Philippines following her having facilitated the exposing of extremely damaging information about the Duterte drug war in Davao City during his time as mayor. The now former senator remains in Camp Crame, despite no convictions having been gained against her, and the recantations of several of the key witnesses who have stated they provided false information under pressure from the government. So while our first thoughts are with those who have been killed, according to NGO estimates, on the order of 30,000 in the Duterte drug war, but if only according to the government estimates, somewhere between 6,000 and 7,000. We also keep in mind those who have faced retaliation for trying to help. One of those people is a speaker here today. I'm pleased that Father Albert Alejo, and extremely important human rights campaigner from the Philippines, who is now faculty at Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome. So Father Albert, you have the floor, and thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, David, Thank you, David, for inviting me, and thank you for those who are attending here in person and online. So again, I'm Father Albert Alejo. Just call me Paring Bert. So this is about fractures. Okay. I just have some pre-notes. One is, I honestly acknowledge that the new national administration of the Philippine government under Ferdinand Marcos Jr. promises to be different from the massive human rights violations inflicted by the previous administration under the leadership of President Duterte. Next. A second pre-note. Next. I'm also appreciative of the reorientation that the Marcos gave to government personnel in approaching the substance abuse, which includes community-based and health-oriented programs that also integrates the participation of civil society. I acknowledge that. Next. But unfortunately, killings continue, and those who have been killed, they're not brought to life again. And the promises for reform, I think, I believe, I assert, I insist, must not be used as alibi for not exacting accountability and justice for past and present surplus of brutality, all in the name of the war on drugs. We cannot say, because there is reform, let's forget about the past. Okay, next. And fourth, I believe the international solidarity, translated as international pressure, can help in the local struggle for justice and sanity in the Philippines and elsewhere. Next. So I pick up from the Vienna Declaration 30 years ago. Human rights and fundamental freedoms are the birthright of all human beings, and their protection and promotion is the first responsibility of governments. Next. On that note, when we say we are building a world that is protective of human rights and dignity, the opposite of these things fractures society. All this fractured, broken into pieces, when in the name of fighting drug syndicates, we end up killing their victims and jailing their defenders. And sadly, that is the case in the Philippines, whether you agree with it or not. Next. So killings fracture society. The principle of respect for the universal human rights and human dignity is mocked when somewhere in the world, in the name of the war on drugs, an average of 1,000 persons are killed in the first 7 months of the Duterte administration, followed by more brutal killings thereafter, and we estimate about 30,000. So that multiplies into families and neighborhoods grieving over their lost loved ones. And right now, Father Flavi is still exhuming some of the bones and ashes. That is the case of the Philippines now under the investigation of the International Criminal Court. Next. So the first 6 months, this is officially documented. We have an average of 1,000 killings a month, whereas the martial law record of Marcos before had 320 killings, unexplained killings in 1 year. The Duterte administration had an average of 1,000 or a little less than 1,000 a month for the first 7 months that were fully officially recorded. Next. I don't want to show images that are so bloody. Now, the other thing is in hospitality to the ICC is against international cooperation. So what else fractures society? Now, there is this international support through the International Criminal Court. When you don't allow the investigation, you're hiding something. Okay, next. I have a very short time. So the building human rights, a world with human rights and human dignity rests on truth, because this principle of human rights rests on rational affirmation of the truth about human beings. But when you declare somebody as subhuman or inhuman, just because they use drugs, they become addicts become criminals, and as criminals, they are less than human and therefore they can be killed. That kind of slippage of meanings attached to the discourse of violence is an attack on truth, and it is translated into an attack on truth tellers. And that includes even those who admit to being part of the killings before. They had spiritual conversion, and now they're saying the Davao Death Squad, the Death Squad is true, and I was part of it. And we need to listen to them rather than attack them. Next. Now, one very poignant symbol of what is still wrong, despite the reforms, what is still wrong in the name of human drugs, of war on drugs, is the continued imprisonment of Senator Laila de Lima. I had the fortune of meeting her when she was investigating the human rights violations in Davao City way back when I was assigned in Davao City. And then we worked together in exposing the violations against human rights according to culprits, according to the killers who we managed, especially through Laila de Lima, to have a platform at the Senate hearing on TV. But the problem was some senators blocked the continuation of the storytelling and instead sent Senator Laila de Lima in prison. I used to say mass together with other priests, Father Robert Reyes and Father Flavio Villanueva, inside the custodial prison next. And so what's our call? Number one, it's quite important to have documentation so that we don't rely on hearsay or false news or fake news. So there are people who are documenting the violations of human rights. Let's support them. Let's encourage further research and analysis and projection of the results of these researches. It is extremely important. Next. We need to support the call, the international pressure on the present government to allow the entry of the investigators of the International Criminal Court. This is very important because some other stories have not yet emerged. And so it's important to also double check the claims of people like us in the civil society. So it's important to get to the truth next. And of course, if this administration, the new administration, is really sincere, and there's no evidence, and the witnesses have retracted their accusations, and 6 judges have in different ways inhibited themselves. No one wants to make a decision. Now, withdraw the case. Please, free Senator Laila de Lima next. Because the major test accusers have confessed that they were just pressured next. The accusations on illegal drug charges simply has no basis. Next. This is next. This is curious because this is a case on illegal drugs when they cannot even identify what drugs were transacted. Is it shabu or is it what? And there's no single gram of evidence. Next. So imagine I'm presenting this not to read, but for the sake of record, so that you can review them. Next. There's no evidence in terms of actual drugs. There's no evidence of conspiracy because the people who are supposed to have been part of the conspiracy said they were not drug lords. They did not know anything. They did not know Laila de Lima. They had no contact with them. And even if they said so previously, now they are retracting. Next. And even the government agencies, the AMLAC, the Bureau of Customs, the bank system, the Bureau, the Commission on Audit, they all said, this is government agencies. We cannot find anything irregular in the accounts of Laila de Lima. So what's the fuss? Next. And so actually we can have an acronym here. No evidence versus Laila de Lima. Drug evidence, lies, innocence, money, attempt to silence the critic. Next. And so we call on, again, free Laila de Lima. Next. Now, we call also not just the government, but civil society. We have our own faults, including the religious sector, including the church where I belong. We have our own scandals. But just because we have our own fault or scandals, we should not be stymied to speak out. We must find a way. We must find the words and the discourse of telling the truth and demanding integrity and exposing lies, even if the process would boomerang on us. And I think we all need to learn how to do that. It's a wounded discourse. of an embarrassed prophet. But still, we need to speak out, even if it boomerangs on us. Next. And a call on all the Filipinos, fellow Filipinos. Now, we can say we cannot do everything, of course, but the minimum is let's listen to the victims. We don't have all the solutions yet, but at least listen to their cries and don't reduce them to statistics. Look at the eyes, listen to their stories, and feel the pain, even if you don't have solution yet. But don't hide the pain, because this fractures our society and destroys our desire, the noble desire to have truth in the service of human dignity, which is the foundation of the United Nations. Next. So maybe I can end with a quotation from Pope Francis, Fratelli Tutti, because he's my boss now in Rome. He says in Fratelli Tutti, human rights are not equally observed in all. Many forms of injustice persist, fed by a profit-based economic model that does not hesitate to exploit, discard, and even kill human beings. He preaches about throwaway culture, but this throwaway culture throws not just garbage, but also lifeless bodies of victims. Let's do something. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Powering Bert. And our next speaker is Mohammed Ashrafuzzaman, known to friends as Zaman, from the Asian Human Rights Center and Asian Legal Resource Center. He's a native Bangladeshi, and he will tell us about the drug war and extrajudicial killings and related matters in his native country. Zaman, thank you.
Thank you very much. Am I loud enough? I hope. Okay, thank you very much. So thanks to stopthedrugwar.org for hosting this event and having us here. And thanks to all of you who have taken the trouble to come here and join us. Briefly, the overall what I'm going to talk about is, of course, many of us, or all of us in this room who have joined online, we have serious concerns about the drug that is also destroying many societies in the world, many young generations. And at the same time, there are many root causes that are not being addressed in the countries that have been facing the challenges of the spread of drug and the institutional issues that are involved in it. So that's basically I'm going to talk about. So, I mean, if you look at Bangladesh, it has it is the incumbent member of the CND, Commission of Narcotics Drug here. And they may be, when you go to the room upstairs during the sessions, you may be listening amazing things from them, which may not always sound the same, what I'm going to talk about. But what I would say is what I hear from the victims and my colleagues, human rights defenders, based within the country. I'm in exile. I cannot go to the country for over a decade. So, I mean, but I have lots of eyes and ears active on the ground. So, I mean, let's talk a little bit about that. The country has death penalty for drug. Like there is a drug called yaba, locally known. It's a combination of the English name is methamphetamine and caffeine. So it's a mixture. Together, this tablet is made, Leo may have a photo, maybe in a minute you will see this. So these, apart from all other drugs, there are many other kinds of drugs that is coming from, this is one. I mean, if the color looks beautiful, but the impact is deadly. So this is at top of the, list in the country at the moment. And the government has, in its recent time amendment to the law in 2018, they have added death penalty of 5 grams of it if anybody produces, possesses, or smuggles. So that would be enough to have death penalty for this. Now, the question is, this drug comes from mostly popularly known as from Burma, Myanmar. And the reason that world hardly knows that who are involved behind trading this. So the person who is known, famous in Bangladesh to be the godfather of drug, he happened to be a member of the ruling party parliament, a member of parliament from the ruling party till 2018. And in the 2018 election, it was not an election, I will come to that point later. So he was not eligible to be a candidate. So the ruling party picked up his wife to become the member of parliament. And this gentleman, he is from Cox's Bazar, where all these Rohingya refugees who fled the genocidal crime from their home and now accommodated in the shabby refugee camps in Bangladesh, in the Cox's Bazar district, along the Bay of Bengal. And that is the main person who controls and collaborates with the law enforcement agencies, all the border guards, and everyone else to trade it, bring it to the country and supply it in the market. The entire chain, he's under his control and associated by the people from the law enforcement agencies, the ruling party, and that. And without assistance, it cannot be done. So now, when you, in one hand, you see the government that adopts law to kill people from the judicial, through judicial proceedings, whether credible or not, that's a different question. And then there is also extrajudicial killings for drug. So hundreds of people have been killed extrajudicially for allegedly carrying or trading drug. And many of them are also the Rohingya refugees who are used by this ruling party, the godfather and his team, in a kind of helpless situation, because everything is under control, under the surveillance of the agencies. And when they are tempted to do this with a little bit of money, and these people are not allowed. It's not a refugee in Europe. Here, a refugee in places they are eligible to work to some extent. But the Rohingya refugees, they are almost like in confinement within the boundary of the camps. They are expected to stay, and they are not supposed to come out of that jurisdiction, the boundary. So these people are used, and others as well. It's not limited to the Rohingya, the native Bangladeshi people who are part of this trade. So they are involved in that. And you can understand, since this Rohingya exodus has come to Bangladesh in August 2017, the kind of security arrangement is made in the government has deployed the armed police battalion in Cox's Bazar, and more numbers of other security forces like the border guards, the rapid action battalion, the armed forces itself, the Navy, the Coast Guard. So all these agencies are in the enough river, which shares the border with Burma and Bangladesh, and then the Chittagong Hill Tracts area, which has high military presence. So how we have to ask this question, that how it comes to crossing across the border, and then it's spread in the other 1,000 kilometers or 800, 700 kilometers of different, corners of the country, without the collaboration of the law enforcement agencies. So the two kinds of execution: one, judiciary, you have the law to kill people, punish with death penalty, capital punishment, and you have the extrajudicial killing. The number has recently been a little less than before. As an impact, one of the impacts of the sanction designated by United States Treasury Department against Rapid Action Battalion, which is known to be the state's death squad. Human Rights Watch exactly used this term, the death squad of Bangladesh. So, and 6 of its top commanders, incumbent and former commanders, they were sanctioned, and 2 of them also got visa ban by the United States Treasury, Department of State. So now the thing is, we need to see the bigger picture here. The bigger picture is, when this kind of situation happens, like a government has a very clear double standard, it is, of course, death penalty is against human rights, very simple. And so you cannot have it. Father has already said life cannot be brought back. So we all know that. I'm not going into that details. So first of all, death penalty should not be there. But then to control your drug, you need very transparent and effective policy. And that is where the problem is. The law enforcement agencies of the country, they don't comply with the international guidelines for using firearms or, lethal force. So that in Bangladesh, it's unimaginable. And the extrajudicial killings, for example, under this government itself, is about 2,700, the documented one. There are also undocumented cases. You may find bodies. Somebody was picked up from, maybe imagine, the northern part of the country, and the body was found in the south or the eastern part, or somewhere else in the middle. So then the poor people, the families, cannot travel all the way to few hundred kilometers to identify the body. So they go, it's not possible to 100% ascertain that, okay, the agencies are involved, but we have seen a very high number of unidentified bodies being found, and these humanitarian organizations are engaged to organize the funerals, because nobody is there to claim those bodies, and the forensic investigation and other kind of facilities is not up to the mark, so that it could be detected that the person is from such and such address, or from such and such families. So in that context, the why it happens, because the government doesn't have any form of accountability, political in the parliament, judicial in the judiciary as a whole, in the justice system, and anywhere else, or internationally. So in that context, when I say that they don't have political or parliamentary accountability, why I say that is, the last 2 elections in 2014 and 2018, they were rigged. The 2014 one, all opposition parties boycotted. So the ruling party was declared the winner, with more than half of their candidates own unopposed. There are no candidate to contest against them. So out of 300, 153, they got elected before the, election started, or the single vote was cast. And then the remaining ones, around 5% turnout, mostly the ruling party people or their relatives. But the election commission, they manufactured a distorted report of turnout, which is much higher than the original. The 2018 election, that happened on 30th December, scheduled to happen, but the government, the election commission, law enforcement agencies, and the ruling party very efficiently, they completed the election before the voting hour started on the previous night. And how it is possible? If you check BBC, or anybody wants, I can share it, and we can show it here. BBC journalist was in Chittagong, one of the port cities in Bangladesh, were at a polling center. And then the journalist found that ballot boxes filled up with stuffed ballot were being carried from one floor to another. And a short video that BBC published, and also photograph. And the journalist also recorded the time, which is before 8 o'clock, the voting was officially supposed to begin. Then Transparency International, they made a survey across the country. And then they found out of 50 constituencies, they were able to do in 50 constituencies out of 300. So they found 47 out of 50, the voting was done on the previous night. So that's how the right to franchise in Bangladesh. And if you have followed the newspaper of the country 2 days ago, the Supreme Court Bar, the highest judiciary of the country, the Bar Association was supposed to elect its leadership. So before the election was supposed to begin, the election commissioner, the chief of the team, was taken by the law enforcement agencies and forced him to resign from his position. And then the government, somebody who is extremely loyal to the government, was replaced by him. And then the police in the Bar Association, which is unprecedented in the history of Bangladesh, they invaded the bar building and beat everybody, lawyers, journalists, whoever was there, all the litigants. So that's how, from national parliamentary election to local government, and in between all the professional bodies or any private entities, nowhere the electoral democratic participation is not tolerated at all. It doesn't exist. So in that context, the judiciary also doesn't function. It's the recruitment, promotion, posting, everything is politicized. You need to imagine this. Because of time, David is reminding me. Yeah. And then there is no resort to go for any kind of victims, whether you are human rights abuse victims or any kind of political violence victims. So that also falls into the category of human rights violation, organized crime. So there is no resort. And that's where this international accountability, for example, the global Magnitsky human rights legislations, regimes in different territories now. The European Union has it, UK has it, United States and Canada, Australia, they have it. So this may play a very effective role. And one of the first things that everybody needs to agree that any change of the human rights or any change of the drug killing in Bangladesh, the first and foremost thing is required is credible election under a neutral government, not this government, because this simply doesn't want people to vote. And then the protection of human rights defenders who are independent and who want to document this, they are facing prosecution Right now, my colleagues Adilur Rahman Khan and ASM Nasiruddin Elan, the secretary of ODICAR and director of the same organization, they also documented extrajudicial killings, crime committed by the law enforcement agencies and security forces back in 2013, and now they're facing cybercrime trial. So trial is about to end in few weeks' time. So if the government remains in office, so by April, they will be in jail for about 10 years, 5 to 10 years, the minimum for the human rights activism. So the international community, the human rights community, they need to raise their voice, do everything possible so that they don't land in jail. And then, of course, the freedom of press and freedom of the civil society, the protection that needs to be there. And I would also encourage and request everyone to think about the sanction regime, how to best use it in the case of Bangladesh. So with that, I will stop here. And if you have questions, I can respond to that. Thank you very much. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Salman. Our next speaker joins us online from London, perhaps. Natalia Kubesch is a legal officer at the UK-based NGO Redress, where she focuses on the use of Magnitsky sanctions to provide accountability for serious human rights violations. Prior to her work at Redress, she practiced at 2 international law firms working on complex financial crime investigations and litigations, and advised on compliance with the UK's sanction regimes. Her pro bono and volunteer work has spanned a range of issues, including help for victims of arbitrary detention and of sexual violence or gender discrimination, and she has volunteered on access to justice initiatives. So thank you for joining us, Natalia.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for having me here today. It really is a pleasure to be speaking on this panel. Today, I'll be looking at the UK's Magnitsky sanction regime and how it can provide a form of accountability for human rights violations committed in pursuance of states' global war on drug policies. I'll be speaking from a UK perspective today, but many points and considerations I will discuss are also applicable to the US and US sanctions regime. Before I start, I'll quickly give you a run through of the points I will cover today. First, I will discuss how human rights abuses committed in the context of the global war on drugs qualify as sanctionable activities under the UK's sanction regime. Second, I will discuss the UK's current landscape of sanctions on perpetrators involved in global war on drug abuses and political considerations that potentially impact governments' willingness to impose sanctions in this context. Third, I will draw on the UK's previous experience of the use of targeted sanctions on perpetrators based in countries the UK considers strategic allies, including the Philippines and Bangladesh, to discuss factors that could increase the likelihood of Magnitsky sanctions. I will conclude by highlighting how sanction submission by civil society serve as an important advocacy tool for people seeking accountability for human rights abuses in the name of the global war on drug policies. Before I go on and set out the UK's Magnitsky sanction regime, it is crucial to flag that the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office encourages civil society to submit dossiers of evidence on perpetrators of human rights violations and request for them to be sanctioned for their involvement in these abuses. It is therefore a regime that encourages and very much relies on civil society engagement and the evidence they can provide. So by way of background, the UK's Magnitsky sanction regime authorizes the imposition of asset freezes and travel bans against individuals or entities involved in certain serious human rights violations. These violations are defined as an individual's right to life, the right not to be subject to torture, cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment, and the right to be free from slavery and forced labor. War on drug policies often serve as an excuse for grossly disproportionate punishment, torture, and extrajudicial killings. Moreover, the persecution, incarceration, ultimately execution of drug users exasperates poverty and leaves children vulnerable to sexual exploitation and modern slavery. Policies promoting such abuses therefore clearly qualify as sanctionable conduct. Further, under the UK regime, a person is considered to have been involved in these violations not only if they have committed a violation, but also if they have overseen or otherwise facilitated, promoted, incited, supported, concealed, failed to investigate it, and benefited from it. This has the potential to capture a broad range of perpetrators involved in promoting war on drug policies, from police officers, army officials, judges, lawyers, journalists, doctors, and politicians, authorizing, overseeing, inciting, willfully ignoring, or benefiting from the abuses. As a final step under the UK regime, the UK government must assess whether sanctions align with certain policy considerations, including the UK's human rights priorities, the scale of the violations, and whether domestic accountability for violation is possible. Now, while stopping violence in the context of the global war on drugs is not per se a UK government priority, stated government priority, individuals that are particularly at risk are those that report on the violence and protest against the government abuses, which squarely falls within UK human rights priorities on the protection of media freedom and human rights defenders. Further, the number of deaths committed in the context of the war on drugs, for example, in the Philippines alone, is estimated at 30,000. And with that, the scale of these abuses substantially exceeds many other instances of serious human rights abuses that have resulted in sanctions by the UK government. Finally, there's a clear lack of domestic accountability. Again, in the context of the Philippines, despite thousands of deaths, only one case has resulted in a criminal conviction to date. All other implicated officers in the war on drugs have received minor disciplinary sanctions or escaped justice altogether. Therefore, on the face of it, government officials involved in extrajudicial killings and enforced disappearances committed as part of the global war on drug policies qualify for sanctions under the UK regime, and such sanctions would align with the UK's policy considerations. Now, having established that these criteria are met, let's look at figures of how many people have actually been sanctioned to date. The answer, disappointingly, is that to date, the UK has sanctioned only 3 Iranian judges and ministers for, among other reasons, having overseen executions for drug-related offences and condoning excessive punishments for drug offences under the Iran country sanction regime. No individual to date has been sanctioned under the human rights sanction regime, and no designation refers specifically to war on drug policies. I'll quickly touch on 2 reasons why this may be the case. First, many countries implicated in human rights abuses in the guise of the war on drugs are deemed strategic allies and trading partners of the UK. Both the Philippines and Bangladesh are considered important partners of the UK in areas of trade, investment, security, and defence. This context creates significant diplomatic sensitivities, impacting UK government's willingness to impose targeted human rights sanctions on the responsible officials in the fear they could jeopardise future relations. Second, the war on drugs is not an area the UK government has paid much attention to recently. The last time the UK government discussed the war on drugs was in the context of human rights violations committed in the Philippines in 2019, nearly 4 years ago. Now, all of this not to say that the prospect of UK human rights sanction is impossible in the case of human rights violation committed as a part of the global war on drugs. Based on what we've seen so far, there are certain factors that can possibly increase the likelihood of UK Magnitsky sanctions, even in cases where there are strong countervailing consideration, such as strategic relationships or economic interest. First, Magnitsky sanction targets specific individuals, not the country as a whole. This gives UK flexibility to select specific individuals responsible for the abuses without necessarily implicating the leadership of the country in question. In practice, what this means is that where there are strong incentives not to jeopardize diplomatic or economic relations, the UK government is more likely to designate lower-ranking officials who committed the abuses, but are not the intellectual authors. For example, in the case of the murder of Khashoggi, the UK government designated 20 Saudi nationals involved in this murder, including mid-level intelligence officers and consulate staff, but crucially omitted Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, despite credible evidence regarding his responsibility for premeditating Khashoggi's murder. In the context of the global war on drugs, this may mean that UK government is more likely to target individual police officers involved in abuses, rather than government ministers creating the policies. It may also mean that it's easier, for example, in the Philippines, where there's been a government change and therefore allows the UK government to target ex-politicians rather than the current regime. Second, UK government is more likely to take action against strategic allies where the US government has already imposed comparable sanctions and so provide a cover for the UK to follow suit. For example, the UK sanctioned against officers responsible for human rights abuses in Xinjiang in March 2021, followed after the US had already imposed such targeted sanctions in July 2020. As Saman mentioned earlier, in the case of Bangladesh, the US has already imposed sanctions in 2021 against the Rapid Action Battalion, which had remarkable consequences, with the number of extrajudicial killings significantly dropping in the 3 months following the imposition of sanctions. Yet in this case, unfortunately, UK has not followed suit and thereby created the risk of making UK a safe haven for RA perpetrators and undermining the US's effort. Finally, both the case of Khashoggi and Xinjiang illustrate that the UK government is more likely to impose targeted sanctions where there's significant international pressure to take action, making it more costly for the government to stay silent than to name and shame their trading partners. In terms of the global war on drugs, there's currently a real momentum behind governments wanting to step up their efforts to protect human rights defenders and journalists, therefore framing abuses committed by government officials in pursuit of a global war on drugs policy along those lines could help capitalize on this momentum. Now, this leads me to my final point. Sanction submission by civil society can actually help create this pressure and so form a crucial part of an advocacy campaign seeking accountability for human rights abuses committed in the name of the global war on drugs. Firstly, in requesting a sanctions, civil society can raise the government's awareness of the abuses committed and demand them to take a specific course of action to address these violations. In making such a concrete demand, they will also have a stronger basis for asking the government to justify their failure to act or explain what alternative routes they propose. In this vein, a request for sanction can also be a catalyst for the UK government to raise abuses in other forums. For example, they can push the UK government to raise these abuses in the context of UN Human Rights Council session, or increase pressure on the government to align trade negotiations with human rights commitments by making, for example, trade agreements contingent on improving the country's human rights situation. Now, to conclude my contribution, I want to stress that human rights sanction can be a key accountability tool for abuses committed in pursuance of global war on drug policies, but their potential is not only being realized when they have been imposed. Requests for sanctions provide a crucial advocacy tool to raise awareness and pressure governments into action. However, they're not a panacea. They're only one tool among several, including international litigation, diplomatic negotiations, and policy advocacy that should together form part of an integrated campaign to secure accountability for human rights abuses committed in the context of the global war on drugs. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Natalia. Now, officially, we end in 1 minute. However, I'm not aware of another meeting in here, and I haven't seen anyone come in to suggest there would be. If someone does, we'll wrap up quickly at that point. So let's start to get an idea whether or how many people are interested in asking questions or commenting. If you can raise your hand right now. Okay, and anyone online, you can use the raise your hand function or turn your picture on and raise your hand. Okay, so looks like so far anyway, we just have a couple. So back there, and if you're willing, no requirement, you're let us know who you are.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much, Dave Borden, for organizing this side event, to the 66th Commission on Narcotic Drugs, and to the speakers that we had today, both in person and online. We're very grateful, especially because you also focused on the Philippine situation. And I'm very grateful to the Filipinos who are in here today, who are very interested in the issue at hand. I would like to direct a question to our dear Father Albert Paring-Bert, because you had specifically addressed the Filipinos. And I assume it's the Filipinos, not just here, but the Filipinos across the globe, because this is being transmitted globally. And if we go back to the slide that you had on your appeal to the Filipinos, where you basically had a slide that says, listen to the victims and authentic witnesses. As Filipinos living abroad, what would be your practical suggestion, recommendation on how we can really do this? It's easier said than done. For example, in Vienna, we have a very active Filipino community in various areas, civic, religious, interest groups. How do we come up with practical ways of transmitting this into action?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Maricel. Now, number one, there are sources of information, not just statistics, but stories about the victims. And check the news from Rappler, from BBC, from Human Rights Watch. And since some of you are organized, maybe you can organize a forum dedicating the time for sharing information. Or if you can, invite some members of the families of the victims so that we can listen to their stories, mothers, wives. Get it firsthand, not from us, not from the advocates, but from those who really get confused on what happened to their families. Okay, so that's important. And second, when I say authentic witnesses, there have been witnesses, those who confess that they were members of the Davao Death Squads, like Edgar Matubato, Arturo Las Cañas. Listen to their stories. I stand here as a witness to their spiritual conversion. Not all of them, not all the persons presented as testimony, as witnesses are okay. Sometimes we get faulted for that, but there are serious conversion stories, spiritual conversion stories, and their stories are precious. They're like I said, embarrassed prophets. So listen to them. I have named two, but there are other people. And finally, listen to Laila de Lima. Listen to Maria Ressa. They're not getting money from their risky adventure. So these stories are precious. Let's not waste lives by killing people, and let's not waste truth by not listening to those authentic witnesses. Thank you.
Do we have any? Okay.
My name is Crystal Joy Ganyu, and I'm really appreciative how honest and sincere you were about the topic, because of course it's a very conflicting topic, and I think at the bottom line we need to look on the underlying issues from where actually the supply and demand come from, and which communities have actually profited or gained or actually have a disadvantage, because we need to consider the health and safety also about the communities itself.
Yeah, thank you very much for raising that. There's a supply and demand. Those who were killed, are they in the supply side or demand side? Generally, the users or accused users. So that is in the supply, the demand side. Now, how many drug lords have we put in jail? How many of the doctoral dissertation, MA researchers track the real syndicates? No, we don't touch these things. Okay. So let's also address the supply side. And Senator Bato said, well, we know the drugs come from China. Why is it that in so many meetings, the 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 flow of the drugs coming from China is not discussed? Now, drugs during the COVID time, that there was an expose on the family. My God, billions of pesos have been wasted and pocketed that were supposed to be spent on medicines and masks and protection. And it was exposed. And the masterminds were from other countries. Why is it that Malacanang itself played the role of lawyering for these masterminds of this unbelievable vampire act of corrupting money intended to protect the people from COVID? Let me say, we are fighting death penalty, but extrajudicial killing is worse than death penalty. It is the same as death penalty because it means killing, but it is worse because you deprive the victims any semblance, any beginning, any first steps of judicial approach. Please, let's find the right words to describe the situation so that we can find the right response. Thank you.
I'd add to that that it's a lot easier and faster to do an extrajudicial killing than to have a trial and due process and execute people under death penalty. And the numbers, certainly from the Philippines, show how much vaster they are. So that's one additional problem with extrajudicial killings. Do we have any other questions or comments? Anyone online? Yes, we have. We have one from online, Andrea. I think you can unmute, but if
Can you hear me?
yes.
Hi, thank you so much for doing what you're doing. It was an amazing session to listen to and very painful. I just would like some clarifications, please. You said something about spiritual and something to do with spiritual conversions, and I wasn't quite sure exactly what you meant in relation to what you were presenting about. I wonder if you could clarify, please.
Thank you very much for the question. I mean, those persons who confess privately and later on publicly that they were members of the death squad
Okay.
under the orders from above, killed because probably initially they thought that was a good thing for society. That's a way of cleansing society. But then later on, when they themselves realized they were killing innocent students, for example, accused of having drugs, but when they raided the houses, there were no drugs, but still they had to kill. So, and they are also haunted by the spirits of the people they killed, asking for justice, not just blaming them, but pleading, please do something, tell the story so that this thing will not happen again. So there is spiritual conversion, and we can talk about this in a different platform if you want. But it's one thing to discuss the victims, those who were killed. It's another thing to discuss those who were part of the killing. In a sense, they are also victims. They said, we have become monsters.
Thank you so much.
Oh, okay. Kenzie?
Thank you. I have to leave for the plenary. It's not really a question, just a comment. But I'm not from Asia, but I find hard to realize how we can balance on the same scale the harm, the potential harms of drug that we know how to reduce these harms, and they don't happen to everybody. Even the most dangerous drugs, they don't kill 100% of their users, whereas extrajudicial killing kills 100% of the people targeted. So the most powerful, the most dangerous, the most horrible drug is extrajudicial killing. And putting the same thing on the balance is just unacceptable to me. And I think history will definitely prove it. So thank you very much for organizing, for your words, and all the best. And I hope sanctions can come in a good coordinated way. And I hope the international community will do everything to assist. And thank you again.
Thank you.
Well, one of the thing, I mean, just, extrajudicial killing is not one thing. For example, if you take Bangladesh, it's an authoritarian regime is there for 14 plus years. And then the extrajudicial killing and high number of enforced disappearances are also going on simultaneously, constantly. So that is ultimately the purpose is to create an entrenched fear in the society as a whole, so that nobody raises question and challenge the power about all these insane actions that they are committing. The crimes, enforced disappearance is under the Rome Statute, it's a crime against humanity. I mean, so these things should not go unseen and unaccounted. So one of the thing is that when we participate in this kind of discussion or convey the message to a larger audience, we feel sad, but at the same time, everyone has a role to play here. Human rights organizations or activists like us, we can document and we can bring it back to the international community. But the international community should also need to act beyond their geopolitical interest, beyond their financial interest. And then human rights should be at the top of their list. Democracy, there is certain basic norms that we must not compromise. That whether there is people have the very basic fundamental rights or not, and rights are protected or not, and people have access to justice or not. So these questions we need to ask. And then if, for example, if a government wants to buy 5 naval ships from one government and military hardware from another government, and then they provide all support in the international voting mechanism for electing to the CND or the GA or in the Human Rights Council, that should not be the business. This business as usual, trade top priority, geopolitics top priority, or second or highest priority, that should not be the position. As long as we maintain that, then we will see a worse world, not only the Ukraine war. There will be even worse situation waiting for us if we don't act right now. So that's why I would request everybody that please do what role that you may have, whether you are a government or in international human rights organization or media or whichever side of the table you are sitting. Please do your job. We are ready to extend our help, our cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you.
So any additional questions or comments? Okay, well, thank you. Oh, yes.
First of all, thank you for organizing, and thank you to all the speakers. Natalie mentioned earlier that we should hold the people responsible for all the human rights violations, and there should be this call to action, right? And my question is, what if the voice is not too loud? Like in the Philippines, for example, the war on drugs, it had a very high approval rate during the time of Duterte. My worry is that the people will forget
the 30,000 lives, the hundreds of victims in Bangladesh, the Philippines, the UK, or places around the world where the extrajudicial killings are happening. So what do we do to keep the conversation going? What do we do for people to care and not forget? Thank you.
Go first.
There's a study that the Philippines is the social media capital, texting capital of the world. Maybe we spend 3 hours facing the cell phone. How much time is spent on educating ourselves on what is happening? So every person who has a cell phone has the capacity to get to know at least one victim. Is that impossible? Let there be a face and a name to the concept. And, we know movie actors and actresses. We know what happens to their love lives. Can we at least know what happened to one family among the 30,000 victims? Isn't that? Because just one face and one name and one child and one voice would be enough to move the heart. And I call upon everyone, get to know at least one victim. Some policemen, they have their own stories of being forced or having qualms. Get to know the real policemen. Get to know the real family members. Get to know real persons. Not just rely on surfaces on cell phones, because the cell phones have no side views. Unlike a human person, you can embrace. It's a three-dimensional thing. Get real. So is that very demanding? I don't think so. Right? Okay. So thank you. Let's educate ourselves. Okay. Thank you.
I will be very short. We don't have time, otherwise I would have explained it not to sell our principles for profit. It's very simple. And we need to act objectively. So regardless which country or which leader is there, if things are going wrong, so we must be with the truth and then act objectively. So subjectivity destroys us. I mean, if we, particularly in the case of this gross violation of human rights, it's not that one peanut dropped somewhere else and we did not look at it, picked it up and throw it to the bin, because it's people's life and death question. 30,000 people died in Philippines killed extrajudicially. That's the conservative figure. The real figure is even higher, I know. And in Bangladesh, the enforced disappearances and extrajudicial killings, the documented ones, you can't imagine how painful is the life of those people. The enforced disappearance victims, how those little children of the man who disappeared every morning sits in front of the door and till the evening waits for the dad to come back and take her to the school on the following day. It's heartbreaking. The extrajudicial killings victims, how the widows, all the families or the mothers, how do they survive? The financial, the social, emotional, the trauma and the heaps of problems. It all goes uncounted. We maybe in another event we will have chance to talk about that. But what is important is that this arbitrary deprivation of life, or in the judicial way, whichever way this is happening, we need to use the instruments that are available in our hand so that it is stopped now. This is an urgent call for everybody. So it may not be like if we are sitting in Europe and living here, it may not be in our home, the extrajudicial killing. But then some people got crazy and started a war. It happens through authoritarianism. All we need to understand the authoritarianism, the absence of accountability, and people's access to the justice mechanism. That's the core of all this. And gradually it becomes monster like Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping. I should not say it here. I live in Chinese territory in exile. I'm sorry. So what we need is that just do our job sincerely with, I mean, sticking to the facts and not being biased to any regime for small or bigger interest.
Okay, anyone else interested in? Yes.
Just the comment to your question. I mean, all these countries that we are listing who are facing drug war they have no freedom of speech, freedom of press. So it's actually also Filipinos or Bangladesh that, like, outside from the country itself, that can speak up. So why is it that only during election time people abroad actually speak up for the country? So actually we can still do that as well here. And yeah, social media is a solution, but why wait for another election is what I'm trying to say here.
That's really a very good point. Is people try to use their freedom of expression staying in abroad, but there are consequences for that. The Bangladesh government has trained a cyber army from the political party, tens of thousands of people, and they are paid from the official, I mean, exchequer, and for each of the intervention that they make. So a lot of things, to be very brief, is that if it is Facebook or Twitter, they complain it, I mean, report that. Post. You understand, right? In Facebook, if you post any critical content about the government regarding corruption or whatever, abuse of power, so that particular individual or entity, the new media outlet, who that are operated from, say, Europe or North America, so those entities or the individuals get their post reported by the cyber army trained by the authoritarian regime. That's one. So they struggle. People who know how to fight this out, they are able to manage it. And those who don't know, so they lose their entire social media account, for example. So this business and human rights, I mean, the accountability of the corporate companies, that's a larger issue, needs to act there. The other thing is their larger family members. For example, a journalist based in Sweden publishes a news online news portal called Netra News, published corruption report of the ruling party, and then the intelligence agency went to his home in Bangladesh, where his mom, like 70 years old senior citizen, a retired person, lives, and in the midnight the intelligence agency banged the door. She lives alone there. There are somebody based in UK, a journalist, two of them. They published report on enforced disappearances and corruption in a media called Weekly Surma. It's a bi-weekly newspaper, bilingual newspaper. So then what happened? The two journalist brothers who live in Bangladesh, they were arrested and detained. So the consequences are also big. Somebody in the United States in exile, again, he published a leaked conversation of the army chief where he confirmed the prime minister's defense advisor gives the command to the national security intelligence to disappear, and somebody called a major general who controls the national telecommunications NTMC monitoring cell. So that guy is also part of the entire group who execute the enforced disappearances. So the army chief was telling his retired military officer friend, batchmate, in a conversation, and the person who was in the conversation, he on that show on a talk show, confirmed that that was his voice and his conversation with the chief of army of that day. Then the journalist's sister, who has nothing to do with his brother's journalism, she got arrested in a narcotics case, again, the illegal drug possession case and a cybercrime case, and detained for 6 months. With her children. Children were later, minor children, they were released later. So, I mean, being mindful to the time, I did not go into the cases, but as you raised, so people are trying their best. I mean, as much as they can, not everybody, but the capable people, but they are also facing consequences. It's not directly them, but their extended family members are paying the price. So that's why it's very necessary that if you have a credible election, then you have the people to decide that who should be their ruler. And on what condition, what kind of manifesto that they should accept or not. But when you have authoritarian system like this with consecutive rigged elections, then you have no room, no place to go. And the problem becomes bigger and bigger. So it's a holistic approach that needed. When we do campaign, not only you are very right, not only before the election time, the struggle should continue every day, 365 days. And then we may, and if it is done relentlessly and very professionally, in a well-articulated manner, then something may happen. For example, at least United States has been a bit responsive that they use their Magnitsky human rights mechanism to sanction few people. It's not enough, but it's a small beginning that has given hope to people. So the other jurisdictions should also be responsive. Thank you.
Thank you. I guess I'll ask probably just one more time, any remaining comments or questions? No? Good. So thank you again for joining us. Glad to see some cameras here. If anyone is doing reporting, whether video or print, we'd certainly appreciate if you can send us a link so we can read and share it. Lastly, I seem to have neglected to include an organization on the sign-in sheet. If you would like us to know who you work with or anything more about us, feel free to write. I can be reached at borden@drcnet.org, the contact info in the email announcement if you have that, or go to our website, stopthedrugwar.org. The contact form also reaches me. Thanks to our speakers for traveling from Rome and Hong Kong, long trip. And again, to our co-sponsoring organizations, and thank you again for joining us.
Yeah.
Oh.
Videographers that we have today, Amir Siddiq, of course, and Mandy Salonga. And if you don't mind, maybe we can have a group photo here. While you sit